Okay, we might get started. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us for the webinar this afternoon. My name is Derek Wilding. I'm the head of the Australian chapter of the International Institute of Communications. So welcome to you for this, the last of our events in this international year of the webinar. If you'd like to catch up on events that we've had previously this year or events from our other branches around the world, you can check the website, which is iicom.org. Just before I introduce you to our panel, I'd like to note that we're spread far and wide today, but I'm here at the Sydney campus of University of Technology, Sydney. So I'd like to note that I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose ancestral lands this campus of UTS now stands. I'd also like to pay respects to elders past and present, recognising them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. So our topic today is choice and fairness in telecommunications, and as no doubt many of you are aware, the Department of Communications has given us a great backdrop for our discussion of telecommunications consumer issues, because a few months ago it released its discussion paper for Part C of the Consumer Safeguards Review. We're fortunate today in that 3 of our Australian panellists have all made submissions to that review, so we should have a great discussion from people who are really into the issues that are on the agenda. Our panel today includes Michael Ackland, who's Group Executive with Telstra Consumer and Small Business, Teresa Corbin, who's CEO with Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, Dr. Karen Lee, who's a Senior Lecturer in the Law Faculty here at UTS, and also Christina Luna Esteban, who's Director of Consumer Policy at Ofcom in the UK. So Christina's presence continues the IIC's commitment to sharing Australian experience with international audiences and helping Australian audiences to understand what's happening in other jurisdictions. Christina was to be live on our panel, and I'm sorry to say that in organising this a few months ago, I forgot to take account of the fact that the UK would go back an hour and we would go forward an hour. So the times didn't work out in the end, but we've pre-recorded Christina's presentation, and I think you'll be very interested in what she has to say. She's discussing the Ofcom's fairness campaign, and particularly the way in which self-regulation rather than government regulation has been used in on a couple of those measures. Okay, so the way that we'll run things today is that I'm going to ask, first of all, Michael and then Teresa to give an introduction to some of the issues from their organisation's perspectives. Then we'll pause for a moment to allow for some reflection on discussion on the issues that come out of that session. Then we'll move to hear from Karen and from Christina. And then we'll bring Karen and Michael and Teresa back in for a discussion before we open it up for any questions from you. So you're welcome to use the chat function as we go and for discussion amongst yourselves. But if you have a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please drop that into the Q&A channel instead. Okay, so let's get underway, and I'll introduce Michael. Michael Ackland is currently Group Executive, Telstra Consumer and Small Business. He joined Telstra in 2016 as Executive Director of Telstra Countrywide, and more recently was Head of Consumer and Small Business Sales and Service Channels. Michael joined Telstra from GE, where he held the role of CEO GE Healthcare, Australia and New Zealand. Prior to GE, Michael was Principal with Boston Consulting Group. So, Michael, in its submission, Telstra presents some overall principles that could guide the review, and they're a bit different from those that the department has presented. Telstra has also endorsed self-regulation and co-regulation as approaches to be used in the future, and you've outlined some aspects of legacy services that you think could be phased out. Could you maybe start by, say, giving us the big picture on Telstra's approach to the review, and then take us through some of the aspects that you think Telstra might, that you think could give way, and for those that remain, the kind of approach to regulation that Telstra sees as fitting.
Of course, thanks, Derek, and thanks for inviting me along to this event. And it's a great topic. And so I'll begin as well by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands that we're on and we meet today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating in this event as well. So I wanted to share a little bit around, I guess, our view around regulatory frameworks from our perspective, and particularly, I think, our focus on why we think it's important that regulation remains outcomes focused. And as part of that, share a little bit of the challenges that we face in delivering simplicity and transparency to our customers in the context of a regulatory environment which is becoming, or could become, more complex over time. So why don't I start with, look, I think, it's important to note, and I spend in my role many hours of every day advocating for customer outcomes and delivering fair outcomes to customers and transparency to customers. And I think it is something that we care deeply about as Telstra, and we have a strong incentive to ensure that we treat customers fairly and we get really great customer outcomes as part of our long-term brand and our long-term role in the community. We do aim to consistently make decisions in the interests of customers and the community. And I'd point to some of the work that was done, particularly through the pandemic, where Telstra was proactive and very motivated to assist people and customers and the broader Australian economy, including suspending job reductions, supporting casual workers, increasing recruitment in Australia, bringing forward CapEx, creating relief programs for small business and consumers, just like we did in the bushfires and like we would do at all other times. So this also included a number of specific steps to protect vulnerable customers during an uncertain time. And really, we took those steps because we believe it's the right thing to do. We didn't do it because it was imposed by any external bodies, but we did it because it was the right thing to do. A couple of years ago, we kicked off what we called our T22 strategy, which again, at its core, was focused on how do we do the right things for our customers by delivering simplicity, transparency, and fairness for all of our customers. And as part of this, we implemented a set of fundamental changes in the way we design products, sell services, and provide customers with support. So that's involved a big investment from us from a digitization perspective to get rid of legacy systems, and to clean up customer data and to put in simpler products and systems so that we can support our customers more easily. We've simplified our products by retiring more than 1,800 plans and putting in 20 core plans backed by a better digital experience. And importantly, removing contracts, trying to provide cost certainty by removing excess data charges from our plans going forward to try to give as much as we can customers that core certainty of cost going forward. So we believe that that strategy and that thinking provides customers with real choice, the flexibility to move between plans, the flexibility to not have a contract and to leave us or join us as they wish, and the certainty of having clear cost certainty as they move forward. So we're committed to delivering transparency, but also not to the extent of overwhelming customers with complex information that they won't read and they don't understand and doesn't help them in making their decisions. So clearly, we don't always get that right. And we want customers to have a positive experience as much as anyone, I think, listening, and I'm incredibly motivated to do that. And I think Telstra is a company. But when that experience is poor, it's poor for all of us. And for example, when a customer doesn't get a product or a service they expect or they've paid for, and we have to remediate or fix an issue, which we will always do, nobody wins. As well as being terribly frustrating for customers, it's far more onerous, time-consuming and costly for us than if we got it right in the first place. And I can't make that point strongly enough. The financial incentive for us to be fair and transparent and get things right the first time, it is significant. Remediation and fixing issues and combing through history to fix things that we've got wrong is expensive, time-consuming and frustrating for everyone. On top of this, it has a huge impact to our reputation. and has broader implications in terms of how we compete in market, which I think is fairly obvious. When things go wrong, and they inevitably do, it's important that we respond quickly and work hard to fix the issue. Since 2018, we've been implementing a comprehensive program to reduce the frequency of the mistakes that we make and their impact on customers. This is including us waiving debts, refunding customers, introducing better processes, rolling out training and tools to assist frontline staff in their interactions, and a particular focus and significant investment from us around how we better identify and work with vulnerable customers, recognizing that customer vulnerability takes many forms. It often isn't permanent. It's around time and place and who they are and the situation they're in, and we need to be very, very alive to that. So regulation is necessary, but it's got to be best practice and fit for purpose. So we recognise the need for regulation where an industry may not deliver the outcomes the government is seeking or the community is seeking without that regulation. We know there's an opportunity to enhance the current regulatory framework and ensure it meets its objectives. And so when we talk about an outcome-based regulatory approach, we think that should always start with clearly articulating the particular problem or the issue the regulation is seeking to address, setting minimum standards or outcomes, and I emphasise that point, setting minimum standards for the outcomes that the regulation is seeking to deliver, and then allowing all of the participants, particularly industry, to determine the most effective way to deliver those minimum standards or outcomes, and then holding industry accountable to delivering those outcomes. The current regime does provide a series of complex rules which prescribe not just what the outcomes are, but how they are to be delivered. The risk with this is we do limit the ability to deliver efficient and innovative services for consumers, and do so in a way that recognises the operational complexity involved in delivering these services. If the rules are overly prescriptive or force providers to solve problems in a specific way that doesn't reflect the reality of how those services are delivered, it does add complexity, it diminishes choice, and adds cost that ultimately is borne by our customers. And there's a very real risk in some of those that we lose sight of the ultimate objective when, as providers, we become slavishly focused on following the detailed process steps. So we have to guard against the unintended consequences of overly prescriptive process steps in a regulatory environment. So unintended consequences can take many forms: added complexity, increased cost for consumers, limitation of services, or distortion of competition if regulation creates significant barriers to entry. So as an example, let's take the recent service continuity standard introduced as part of a suite of direct regulation in the form of the NBN customer experience instruments. The outcomes are something that we all absolutely agree on, but they are highly prescriptive and, in a very practical sense, very complex, and as such require a great deal of focus on very specific compliance. It's worth asking what impact these rules have had on competition in the retail market. What choices will different kinds of retailers, what choices might different kind of retailers make in response to that? And what parts of the market will people choose to participate or not participate in if those barriers to entry apply differentially across the NBN environment? And on the counterfactual, to what degree could competition itself have better harnessed to deliver the desired outcome? So I'm not suggesting the outcome isn't what we wanted, but when the rules are overly prescriptive, we just have to guard against unintended consequences. And of course, we want customers to have a great experience transitioning to the NBN. But there have been some challenges in the details of those rules where we've lost sight, I think, at times, of some of the outcomes we need, and we do need to be aware of unintended consequences. So outcome-based regulation can deliver the necessary behavioural change that we need, and continuing to focus on those outcomes and testing ourselves as an industry and as a sector against those outcomes can drive the behavioural change that we need. And behavioural change is always somewhat needed over time. It's not a static thing. Our view at Telstra is the ideal regulatory scenario would be a regulator defines the outcomes that need to be achieved. The process by which industry can deliver against those outcomes is developed by the industry itself. To explain, we are advocating for a change from the current process to a model that is strongly outcomes-based. The term outcomes-based regulation may mean different things to different people, When I refer to outcomes-based regulation, I mean that the regulator or government community group sets an outcome it wants to achieve and is clear up front about the behavioural change it is seeking from the industry. So moving on to the co-regulatory process and improvements to rulemaking. So because I'm not saying that the industry doesn't need to follow rules, we absolutely need rules to follow so that we know whether we're compliant. And absolutely the industry needs to be held accountable for delivering real outcomes and tested against those in terms of true customer outcomes. Despite the benefits of the flexibility associated with an outcomes-based regulatory objective, we acknowledge the tension between outcome-based goals and the need for suppliers to have certainty as to what compliance is with an outcome and what that looks like, and our regulators need to be able to enforce non-compliance with regulatory obligations. Once the outcome's clear, the industry should be tasked with determining the best processes to deliver against that outcome, and then should absolutely be held accountable for achieving it. So to wrap up, I know there'll always be different points of view on this, about the type of regulation which is most effective to address any issues in any industry. For our part, we believe that it's critical we ensure that the regulator sets the minimum standards or outcomes that an industry needs to achieve, but leaves it to the industry to develop the most efficient and innovative way in which to meet these standards and these outcomes, and then the regulator to hold the industry accountable for achieving those outcomes. It is complicated and we won't get it right every time. And no approach will protect us from unintended consequences of overly prescriptive rules deviating from the outcomes that we want or having unintended consequences. The complexity that we have in our business is a key driver of our T22 strategy to radically simplify our products, our services, and remove customer pain points. We are at a critical stage of this transition. It'll take another 18 months before we're in a position to remove those pain points, but we are committed to seeing this through and supporting our customers through a transition to a much better future. Derek, I'll end there. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. So before we come to discussion of that, we'll go to Teresa and hear from you, Teresa. So let me just give a brief introduction. So Teresa Corbin is co-founder of ACAN, formed in July 2009. She was appointed Chief Executive Officer in 2010. From 1995, she worked in various roles at Consumers Telecommunications Network and was Chief Executive Officer from 2003 to 2009. In 2015, she was awarded the Charles Todd Medal by the Telecommunications Society for having made an outstanding contribution to Australian telecommunications in recent years. So Teresa, ACAN seems to be mostly in agreement with the department's principles, and you indeed, ACAN has made 17 recommendations of its own. Michael spoke there about the need for to provide consumers with information and be transparent, but at the same time to avoid complexity. You've spoken about the information as well, or ACAN has in its submission. You've spoken about information asymmetry and that disclosure might not actually be sufficient in all circumstances, particularly where there's harm. So I wonder if maybe you could address that point, but then also, like Michael, I guess, give us the kind of the in brief view of ACAN's approach to the issues raised in the review, and in your case, I guess, ACAN's view about the desirability of moving to a regulatory model, which is quite different from the outcomes-based approach that that Michael has just outlined, and also anything that you want to say on the kind of the remaining services that you think should be still subject to regulation. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek, and thanks for the invitation to the panel today. Before I go any further, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we're joining this webinar today. For me, it's the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and also acknowledging the Indigenous peoples attending today and their elders past, present and emerging. So yes, information asymmetries, it's been a bit of a debate for many years now, and for those who haven't come across the term before, it exists when one group of people have more information than another group of people, and it is particularly a problem if you're actually in some kind of a financial transaction, and there's a consensus that where information asymmetries actually exist, then consumer markets can't really be truly competitive, because consumers are not on an even playing field with the providers of whatever service it is. So it makes it very difficult for consumers to make a proper choice. And it's pretty clear to us that there is a significant asymmetry in the telecommunications industry when it comes to information. And this is because of the increasing complexity of telecommunications services and the market, not just the types of technology that we're using, but also the amount of different providers and types of providers that there actually are. And from our perspective, it's exacerbated even further by the fact that we've had a long tradition of unsatisfactory customer service in this area, and this is well and truly documented by the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman complaint levels, and now of course the information that the ACMA reports also put out there. So from our perspective, information asymmetries are really a very big problem for consumers, and ultimately that it actually means that consumers rely much more heavily on regulation. And in the past, some of the regulation that has existed to actually address this asymmetry has in fact actually exacerbated it as well. And a good example of this is the type of disclosure statements that we see that are very complex online. In the telecommunications industry, in the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Code, there was an attempt to simplify this through the critical information summaries that are now provided. But of course, there are significant groups that may fall into the category of what some people call vulnerable consumers, who cannot actually benefit very much from disclosures. And these, of course, include people who are suffering hardship, language barriers, disability, potentially literacy levels. And this will ultimately, if they cannot take advantage of the disclosure, affect their real world decision making when it comes to consumer choices. And we also know that the reality of that is not a straightforward, easy thing based on all the behavioural economics studies that have been done. So disclosure is really, generally speaking, a one-size-fits-all and approach to communicating to consumers. And we have documented many, many examples of consumers coming to us where they have not had the full information when they've made a choice. And the most straightforward example of this is people using screen readers who are blind, people with disabilities, who go to a provider's website and the website is simply not accessible. And this happens on a regular basis. So just to talk a little bit more about our actual submission, and here I want to acknowledge, and just see if I can go to the next slide. Yeah, now we're doing all the slides. Okay, does that go on? No, it doesn't. There we go. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge Rebecca Sarkozy, who's actually the driving force behind this submission. I have to say that this was a very extensive area of review that the department is currently undergoing, and we really welcomed it because it's a very timely debate and discussion. In summary, ultimately, we think that you have to look at this whole area of fairness and choice in the context of, you know, how and what are we using telecommunications for now? And the reality is, not just because of the pandemic, but very highlighted as a result of the pandemic, telecommunications is more essential than ever. And so we actually need to make sure that we have a regulatory regime that actually backs that up, that actually makes sure that no one is missing out, because the consumer protection regime and framework that backs that up is actually in place to support that. And as a result of that, we actually do think there's quite a few areas that could be strengthened. And we think that we need to obviously improve also the way that we're making telecommunications rules and the content of these rules, and of course their enforcement, by making sure that the ACMA, the regulator, has adequate powers to enforce the regulation. And I think Derek pointed out to us, we have 17 different recommendations. So yes, there is a long list of them, but probably some, just to pull out a couple that are quite significant. We believe that telecommunications services need to have some kind of retail licensing scheme implemented that binds the RSPs and that are operating in the residential and small business market to some specific ways of behaviour and that if you don't behave a particular way, then you can actually have some consequences. At the moment, there are no consequences. And in fact, there's quite a long process if the regulator decides it wants to enforce an industry code of practice, which may eventually lead to a fine, but ultimately, a lot of consumers feel as if the regulation in place is not effective and does not produce the outcomes that they want. So we do think that there needs to be there needs to be an easy way for the ACMA to implement regulation, to notify when compliance is not happening, and to act when there are breaches in a timely and direct enforcement manner, which we don't think is actually the case at the moment. And the sorts of reasons the areas we think have to have stronger regulation relate directly to ensuring that consumers whether they're in an ongoing vulnerable situation or, in one circumstance might be perceived as vulnerable, where they might face financial hardship, disconnections, credit management action, or customer service and issues. We think there actually needs to be proper benchmarks. And so there does need to be an infringement process. And we think there should be, similar to the energy market, there needs to be a national consumer protection framework for telecommunications. I think it's also quite important to note here that this, just to highlight that, because I think Derek asked me to highlight how is our position different from Telstra's. Well, I think, we obviously agree that there should be standards, but we're not too sold on minimum standards. We think the appropriate standards need to be in place. When it relates to consumer protection, there should be industry standards that are mandated, that are linked with enforcement action. When it comes to technical or interoperational matters, we don't have a problem with it being a co-regulatory or even self-regulatory guideline or code, but that where codes apply, it shouldn't be a case that that consumers are in there directly negotiating on what terms might end up being in the clauses, might be in the code, that the code is, the standards are actually identified and codes are identified in a much more less conflict-based arena. And I think also I want to point out here that Michael said that we need to be careful of adverse outcomes, and I totally agree with him. However, I think that there has been more of an emphasis on the adverse outcomes for providers than for consumers. So the emphasis has been far too much in the other direction, and that, we need to identify the costs on consumers, particularly small businesses that are easier. We can actually quantify that, and we will be publishing some research soon that actually quantifies the impact on consumers when regulation doesn't actually meet their needs and delays happen in getting the kinds of services that they need. I think also I wanted to make a comment about some of the legacy arrangements, and I know Michael didn't really go into this, but in the Telstra submission, Telstra really argues for a relaxation of a lot of legacy arrangements, and we would agree that pre-selection, I won't go into what that is, could definitely be something of the past, but I think I just I just didn't share my screen, but that's okay. We'll keep going. But so whilst we think pre-selection could be relaxed, we think that a lot of the other legacy arrangements, such as untimed local calls, number portability, price controls on Telstra, still need to remain, because of the fact that the customers that they're really targeted at are still using fixed line services largely, and also a lot of rural and regional customers have come forward and said to us that these arrangements, operator assisted calls, itemised billing are still very, very important to them because of the types of services that they're more likely to be using in regional areas. I think I might stop there, Derek, because I think we'll cover off some of the other areas in some of the conversation.
Great, thanks very much, Teresa. Yes, so we maybe we'll come back to the point about the use of co-regulation and Michael's point about the outcomes-based regulation. Maybe we'll come back to that a bit later when we've brought Karen in and we've explored that a bit further. But I wondered, you both have covered a range of issues, including there we went to enforcement aspects and the registration scheme, and also the legacy services that might or might not be retained. So I wonder if, while we have this opportunity, is there anything that you would like to say in response to each other? So Michael, Teresa's just given us a view. Is there anything that you'd like to say arising out of what she's just outlined?
Yeah, I think broadly, I think our objectives are, I think, broadly the same. And I think in terms of when Teresa talks about a retail licensing scheme, and to make sure we're focused on the right outcomes, to make sure that when customers are dealing with retail service providers, it is not a position of conflict, and there is sort of, clear guidelines in terms of the remediation that is appropriate. I think those are things that are really worth discussing, and actually having sort of clear views, as she pointed out, in terms of what that remediation should be, I think does simplify things for everyone. I think the point on vulnerable customers and how we think about the benchmarks there, is important. And I think that the sort of between minimum standards and other standards, I think that's a good discussion, and I don't think we're going to be a long way apart. I think on some of the legacy things, I think we made some arguments that some of the legacy obligations should really only be retained if they've got enduring relevance as we move towards the NBN, and also looking at the product constructs that exist in market. And we think there's some there that can be looked at, but I just think it's how you sort of create a level playing field for all the retailers, particularly as the NBN goes through. So, I think. So the other one I thought was also interesting, and I think is a really big one, is the one around information asymmetry and the difficulty in making that work. And so we've done quite a lot of work on how you work with vulnerable customer groups in terms of education around telco literacy as being something that we think is very important to disclosure and making that work. I think that's important. I think the accessibility point, is incredibly important. And, I believe there are standards on that we all are working towards and need to comply with. But I couldn't agree more around both accessibility and sort of the challenges on disclosure and information asymmetry.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. We've had a question that I might drop in now, but Teresa, is there anything else that you'd like to say while we're on these points?
No, I think go to the question. It's a good one.
Okay, so we have a question, Michael, about Telstra's customer service staff, and particularly when they're run at overseas call centres, and I guess a lack of understanding of the position of vulnerable people in Australia who are contacting Telstra. And so the question then is focused on Telstra's, what's said to be Telstra's lack of provision of a specific human rights considerations in respect of vulnerable consumers. So essentially that's I guess it's a question about seeking more recognition of and a culture within Telstra that might recognise that better.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's something we've been working incredibly hard on, and we've done, particularly over the last 18 months, quite a lot of work in trying to do two things. One is to identify vulnerable customers in our base based on the information that we have about them, and based on their interactions with us, to try to understand that. And we actually flag now those customers in our base, and we do our best to route them either to specific groups of agents where we think they will better deal with those customers, but also doing work with analysing sort of the call records. So we have, live call analytics across all of our voice calls to then go back and follow up with some customers. Now, it never works 100% of the time. It is difficult to pick that up, but what we're working on is to both try to get those customers to the right place at the start, and we're working very hard on how do we get, once, if they haven't got to the right place at the start, to work hard on escalation. And so we've done a tremendous amount of work in terms of setting up these specialist teams in a whole range of different areas, both from sort of, financial hardship, domestic violence, languages other than English, Indigenous groups where there may be some special needs due to remoteness and where cultural sensitivity is important, other elements of disability and accessibility. But I would be the first to say it's difficult to get that 100% right at scale, but it is a very, very significant focus from the business, and we've done quite a lot to flag and try to put in different management approaches, as well as a change in our approach to how we deal with escalated issues that have occurred, including significant updating to policy and so on and so forth. But I would accept there'll be many examples where that hasn't gone well, of course.
Okay, all right, thanks, Michael. We better move on very shortly. I just wanted, Teresa, is there anything that you'd like to say on that, or we move on to Karen?
I think sometimes what actually happens on the ground is quite different to what might be intended by Telstra's management, because I have to accept and acknowledge that there have been some really excellent statements made by your CEO, by Andy, in recent times in relation to vulnerable consumers and the desire to do much better. But unfortunately, I think that it's still playing out on the ground that a lot of people are not getting what they need. And perhaps that's exactly what the comments in the chat's about. And that's the kind of experience that we often get reflected back to us. And I will acknowledge that, we get an enormous amount of complaints in telecommunications, but there are an enormous number of customers. I accept that. But of course, every customer's issue is going to be important to them, isn't it? So
yeah. No, failing one customer is one too many. And I saw the note. I didn't mean to be corporate speak. I apologise for that. This is something that is deeply and personally very important to me. And I hope you know that, Teresa, in terms of our interactions. It's something I care very deeply about and spend a lot of my time on. So I apologise if that sounded like corporate speak. And I do apologise to any of those customers that anyone on the chat is dealing with, that they've felt we haven't dealt with correctly, and I will intervene personally with every single one that I can get to. So
I think the thing is that, like, whilst I have these great conversations with you and also with the CEO, and we have the CEO's Consumer Forum, which is fantastic. There's definitely a desire to improve things, but of course the general belief is that things will only improve if the regulatory system actually enforces that as well. And that's no comment on your personal desire and commitment to improve it.
Okay, well, on that note, maybe we'll come back to that aspect. There's been a question about where it's most appropriate to use direct regulation as opposed to co-regulation and self-regulation. So we'll take that question a little bit later when we've heard from Karen and Christina, because it relates directly to what we're going to cover next. So Karen, thanks for your patience. So let me give you a brief introduction. So Dr. Karen Lee first joined the UTS Faculty of Law in June 2019. Her PhD involved an in-depth study of the development of 3 telecommunications consumer codes by working committees of the Communications Alliance. Her book, The Legitimacy and Responsiveness of Industry Rulemaking, was published by Hart Publishing in September 2018. In November 2019, with me, she completed a research project funded by ACAN examining consumer and public engagement in industry rulemaking in a converged communications environment. Karen's also a member of the team that prepared joint submissions of the Public Interest Journalism Initiative and Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas on the Mandatory News Media Bargaining Code for the ACCC. So Karen, I think you're going to provide us with some comments on co-regulation under Part 6 of the Telecommunications Act, and look at the research from last year giving us an idea of what responsiveness might look like in this kind of environment.
Sure, yeah, okay. All right, thanks very much, Derek. I'll just share my screen before we get started. Okay, and before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the Onawan people, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining you today. So I'll begin by providing some background information about, hang on, let me go to slideshow here, hold on. There we go. I'll begin by providing some background information about the research we conducted. And the research focused on three principal questions. Really, how do self and co-regulatory schemes involve consumers and the public? Secondly, how should the success and limitations of the current engagement mechanisms be evaluated? And then finally, how might our findings inform the design of a converged regulatory framework? Now, in terms of to answer each of those questions, we reviewed the literature. We identified 20 self and co-regulatory schemes in the advertising, media, online, and telecommunications sectors. We prepared various summaries of their rulemaking processes and mechanisms of consumer and public engagement. Now, because the rulemaking activities of these schemes are confidential, our summaries were based on publicly available information such as annual reports. These summaries were then sent to each scheme for comment. And in addition to that, we interviewed representatives from Comms Alliance twice, as well as representatives from ACMA and ACAN. Once we'd gathered all the data, we then held a series of roundtables, 3 roundtables, one for each of consumer, industry, and regulators. And as Derek's already mentioned, the research was funded, were made possible through a grant from the research from ACAN's grant scheme. Before explaining and making some observations about Comms Alliance's engagement practices, I just want to touch briefly on the framework that we use to evaluate, or at least start to evaluate, the engagement practices of the various schemes. And we adopted a responsiveness really as responsiveness as a benchmark. And this was done because it underpins a number of highly influential theories of regulatory design, such as Ayers and Braithwaite's responsive regulation, as well as Gunningham and Grabowski's notion of smart regulation. And in each of these theories, kind of responsiveness is seen as a precondition for regulatory effectiveness. Responsiveness is also frequently cited by governments and regulators, both in Australia and worldwide, as a reason for self and co-regulation. However, despite its influence in regulatory and government circles, there's no clear or kind of comprehensive definition of the term. The vast majority of the regulatory literature dealing with responsiveness has focused on its requirements in the context of compliance and enforcement. And because of that focus, it's assumed that responsiveness centers exclusively on the relationship of regulators with their regulatees, and the factors that regulators should consider when seeking to enforce and ensure compliance with the law. Nevertheless, I mean, the concept of responsiveness is also relevant to the rulemaking context, and it's increasingly being recognized that responsiveness is not limited to the kind of these narrow kind of technical understandings that have become associated with it. Rather, it has an explicit normative democratic underpinning, and that's an underpinning that requires regulators and regulatees to take into account the needs of the broader public, including stakeholders and kind of general members of the public, so consumers and citizens. This is important if kind of the problems of regulatory capture are to be avoided. Now, we therefore adopted a definition of responsiveness that accords with the rationales that underpin the principles of procedural and institutional legitimacy in traditional rulemaking. So, and when I'm talking about traditional rulemaking, I'm talking about legislative and administrative rulemaking. And the principles that we picked up on were deliberation, impartiality, which we've, Derek, we've subsequently kind of suggested could more accurately be described as more a kind of an obligation of consideration, as well as notions of transparency and accountability. All right, now the schemes we identified have used 22 different mechanisms of public engagement, 12 of which have been used by the Communications Alliance and its predecessor, ACIF. And I've listed those 12 mechanisms for you on the slide. Now, like other schemes, Comms Alliance has used mechanisms in conjunction with others, and certainly mechanisms used outside of its rulemaking activities may have indirectly influenced their rulemaking activities. So for example, CEOs of Comms Alliance and ACAN meet quarterly. ACAN also does have annual meetings, say, with the Comms Alliance's Industry Consumer Advisory Group. Now, 4 mechanisms in particular have become important for consumer code development. They are complaints data, written submissions on draft rules, working committee participation, and consumer views being solicited by a consumer body, which is ACAN. And it's worth noting that written submissions on draft rules and complaints data were the 2 most commonly used engagement mechanisms by by the 20 schemes that we had a look at. Now, problems accessing data prevent a comprehensive assessment, but nevertheless, what we did gather enables us to draw some conclusions about Comms Alliance's performance. So consumer industry and government representatives all acknowledged that stakeholders from some communities, particularly vulnerable communities, have been missing from consumer engagement activities. And they are not participating even though they may have relevant information. These missing stakeholders confront what we referred to as a number of barriers to their participation. That includes things like technical complexity, motivational barriers, such as competing demands for their time and attention, distrust of the rulemaker, and cynicism about the likely effect that public engagement will have on the final outcome. Consumer representatives emphasize that public consultation often occurs too late, especially if Comms Alliance and other schemes are genuinely interested in reaching vulnerable people and obtaining a wider diversity of views. Comms Alliance has used a number of other engagement practices on an ad hoc basis, and certainly appears to be, or at least indicated to us, that it was open to considering other options. And this is particularly important in avoiding the situation that arises with the broadcasting codes, where written submissions on draft codes are often the only opportunity for consumers and citizens to engage. Now, among the 20 schemes that we examined, the formation of working committees was the only example we could find of more comprehensive participatory type of practices. And when I'm referring to the term participatory here, I mean kind of two-way exchanges between consumer and industry representatives. Now, Comms Alliance has used this particular mechanism far more widely than any other industry schemes. And consumer groups expressed certainly a number of reservations, which Teresa has kind of touched on, or kind of briefly alluded to earlier, about their participation on working committees. But the inclusion of consumer representatives on working committees does appear to allow for more meaningful consumer input into the rulemaking process. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean that the Comms Alliance engagement practices are perfect, but it does indicate that the Comms Alliance is performing better than its peers in the engagement space. And the other kind of distinguishing feature in the telecoms in the engagement area is really the presence of ACAN. It's committed the time needed to participate in working committees, and it can draw on the experiences of its membership base, offering some important ways to address some of the barriers to participation that I've just identified. Now, I think, Derek, you'd also asked about kind of broadly my thoughts on kind of co-regulation if it were to be wound back. Now, I've confined my comments to kind of the engagement area. And certainly kind of one of the difficulties and frustrations of working in this area from an academic standpoint is really kind of because the confidentiality of many aspects of the co-regulatory process makes it very difficult to engage in robust evidence-based analysis. But I would kind of really just like to kind of make two comments, and then we can kind of open it up for discussion, is that I do think that we need to be conscious of what might be lost in terms of consumer engagement if there is a shift from co-regulation back to more state-centric, direct forms of regulation. Very much kind of co-regulation at the moment, kind of from I suppose, an outsider's perspective and from the research that I've undertaken. Certainly it's offering a seat at the table for consumers, which is rarely provided even by government. And I think there needs to be some thought given to that. And then also I think there's going to be a need for the department to consider, well, how might the current dialogue that is taking place between ACAN and other organizations, how can that be maintained? Because I think continues to be very important that industry as well as government continue to hear the consumer voice, and kind of a shift to direct regulation, almost, kind of what I wouldn't want necessarily to see is that kind of consumer efforts are then targeted only to government, when in fact they could be. In my view, they also need to be and continue to need to be targeted to the industry participants themselves.
Okay, thanks very much. Oh, sorry, Karen, is that it?
Yep, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. So I think we'll hear from Christina, but I might just ask you to hold on to a thought, which we'll come back to after we've heard from Christina, because we've got we do have three distinct ideas emerging here. So if regulation is a kind of a spectrum, we've got Teresa and ACAN observing what might be a kind of a desire for a move to what you described as a less conflict-based arena, which is where government prescribes rules and consumers and industry would be consulting through government. We've got Michael, who's saying that a more outcomes-based approach and less prescriptive rules is more appropriate, including solving some of the kind of the time issues and so on with consumer codes. We've got Karen, who's making a point that somewhere in the middle of that, about, at least in principle, what kind of a co-regulatory environment might offer in terms of the way in which it enables consumers to be a part of the kind of the rulemaking environment. So we've got different points on that regulatory spectrum. I'm now going to go to Christina's video, because she's directly talking about this fairness and choice issue, and she's pointing to a couple of areas in which Ofcom has moved towards a more self-regulatory environment. So let me now share Christina's video with you. Okay.
I would like to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to be here today, even if time differences mean I cannot make it in person, and tell you all about Ofcom's drive to deliver a step change in the quality of service that the UK telecom sector provides and ensure that customers are treated fairly. Fairness for customers is a key priority for Ofcom and our consumer policy work. We want consumers to get a fair deal for the service. It is as simple as that. That's not to take away from the fact that our sectors generally work well and there are
Derek. Oh. Sorry, Derek, I think you've muted yourself. We can't actually hear the video.
set out to change this.
Sorry.
Because in our view, service quality is a key ingredient of a healthy and competitive industry that delivers for its customers. The review produced a 10-year strategy, which we are still implementing, and which concluded that improvements were needed across the whole of the communications industry at all levels, wholesale and retail. Today, I will talk a little bit, obviously, about those initiatives at the retail level and what we have done to encourage communications providers to improve quality, and also what we are doing now, which is shifting our focus towards our fairness for consumers strategy. So our flagship project in this journey has been our automatic compensation scheme, which launched in April 2019, and that was really to drive our quality and fairness agenda. I will tell you a little bit more about it a little bit later on, and also because this was an interesting debate whether to go for regulation or a voluntary scheme. Other measures to improve quality of service have included giving better information to consumers to help them compare providers through our compared service quality reports, and other initiatives such as the broadband speeds code of practice and the Boost Your Broadband information campaign. And as I intimated before, the focus on quality of service has now developed into a focus on fairness, ensuring that fairness for customers is at the heart of practices throughout the communications industry. So just to give you a very good quick flavour of the Compared Service Quality Report, we first produced this in 2017 and it's annually, and it's part of our strategy to inform and empower consumers. You can go to our website and have a look at it. And the purpose really is to shine a light on the varying services of different operators, giving consumers the information that they need to shop around and hold providers to account. It really gives an incentive for providers to improve, and we have seen this already. For example, when we started, call times were about 4, 5, or even 7 minutes, and now they have reduced to about 1.5 minutes. That's really a good thing, although obviously the pandemic has reverted some of the progress here. So just to turn to our automatic compensation scheme, as I said, it was a key piece of our strategy, and it really drove our fairness agenda. And this is a scheme that provides broadband and landline customers with compensation if something goes wrong with the service without having to ask for it. And really the incentive, as I said, was for them to receive the money automatically and also to give an incentive to providers to improve the service quality. And it was the first time really that fairness reasoning started to come through in our decision making. As I said, it launched on the 1st of April 2019. Major providers such as in the UK, such as BT, Sky, Virgin joined. On the 28th of October 2019, we had a couple of other providers joining, and in 2020 we were hoping 3 more would join. We're still hopeful of that. It may now be beginning of 2021. So how does it work? Well, consumers who experienced delayed repair, delayed start of service, or a missed appointment will get different amounts of compensations, which is set. And in practice, around 90% of consumers are covered and will get compensations of about £8 a day if the problem isn't fixed quickly. £5 a day if the service does not start when it was agreed that it would start, or £25 a day if an engineer misses an appointment and they don't get 24 notice. So why a voluntary deal and not regulation, as I intimated before? Well, there are some, we thought hard about this, but the quick answer really is that the final voluntary deal that was brought forward by industry met all our regulatory conditions really, and we knew it would be quicker to implement. Now, it is possible that some providers would have challenged us as well had we gone for the regulatory route, and this would have introduced lots of delays, and then consumers would have lost out. And as I said before, we now have 90% of the market already receiving the compensation when things go wrong. So yes, there are some risks, but the benefits to consumers really outweighed those risks in our view. So can a voluntary scheme work? That's a question that I get asked quite a lot. And I think in my experience, the answer is yes, but you have to have a number of ingredients. So the industry has to be incentivized early on in the process. And we had a bit of a carrot and stick approach where we gave the industry the opportunity to get involved in the design of the scheme, but we also had a parallel regulatory scheme running alongside it. So there was a credible threat of regulation, and it was important, and that was really important to get the providers to engage constructively. And it was also reputationally good for the main providers to be seen to be doing the right thing. So that played in their favour. And they all had the same incentives. They all wanted to avoid regulation, and they were more or less in the same place in terms of the amount of compensation that should be given and how it would work in practice. But it's important that, my last point really is that it's important to keep the pressure on. And under the voluntary scheme, providers have to provide Ofcom information on a yearly basis about the amount of compensation they pay and how it's working, and we are monitoring that. And we actually presented our first report on the effectiveness of the scheme in August 2020. And in general, we have identified very few problems with how the scheme was operating. Where there were some issues at the beginning, they were dealt really quickly by the providers. And the scheme really has increased the amount of compensation that is given to consumers from around, I think, 8 million when we estimated it to about 21 million. Obviously, of course, what we want, is the reverse, that the amount goes down, because that means there aren't that many compensation events that are applicable, but still, at least when they happen, consumers are being compensated for that. We're also increasing the amount of compensation that the scheme will be paying for next year in line with inflation. And we will continue to monitor the effectiveness of the scheme and including collecting data. And we have left the door open to regulation, which is also important. So we now have the building blocks to increase the quality of service. So the focus of our strategy has shifted towards putting fair treatment of customers at the heart of every provider's business. And what we mean by this is that companies should make it as easy as possible for customers to do business with them. Customers expect to be treated fairly, and they should be confident that that is part of their provider's culture. And this has not always been the case, and it is not always the case among broadband, phone and pay TV companies. So, as I keep saying, we want customers to get a fair deal for their services. So we have a program of work to improve fairness for customers, which really boils down to ensuring people get a fair deal and are treated well by their providers. And this program of work covers a lot of aspects that is underpinned by the Fairness for Customers commitments that were signed by all the UK biggest broadband, phone and pay TV companies in June 2019. And some of these commitments that you see on the screen are aspirational. Some are backed by our rules of our voluntary codes, but they all have at their heart the belief that people should get a fair deal and should be treated well throughout the entire journey, from entering into a contract, during the contract period, and through exiting that contract too. And all the major providers in the UK have signed up. again, it's covering around 90–95% of the industry. And we are publishing a progress report early next year, and we will be reviewing how well companies are delivering against what they have promised to do and how they're shaping up against their commitments. And we're also including how companies are treating customers during the pandemic, because I think that's also an important aspect to reflect. As part of our fairness agenda, we have also published a fairness framework, and we did this at the beginning of the year, because we recognize that fairness is sometimes difficult to sort of pin down, and assessing what is fair is not always easy. So the framework really assesses how Ofcom is likely to assess fairness issues and the kinds of concerns that will prompt our intervention. And the questions really that we ask ourselves before we even decide to start on a project or on a case, and and how we assess that case. So what have we been doing since our sort of focus shifted towards fairness over the last year or so? So 2 of our flagship projects have actually led to voluntary commitments from providers. The first one is the review of mobile handsets, and there we looked at how mobile customers are charged for handsets when sold in a bundle contract. We agreed voluntary commitments with all but one provider to reduce the price after the contract ends, because we had concerns that people kept paying the same amount after the 2 years, even though in reality they had paid for the handset. So as I say now, after the 2 years now, with all providers apart from one, people will see that the amount they in the contract price reduced by a certain amount, and that differs by providers. Obviously, what we want is for them to engage and to contract or move, because that's not, the discount is not the best outcome, but it's better, I guess, than having the same price. And we also reviewed broadband pricing, and again, our concern here was that some out-of-contract customers were paying very high prices when they could have saved money by signing a new contract with the same provider, or indeed by switching to a new provider. So, we worked hard with lots of major broadband providers in the UK, and we secured commitments from them to protect their vulnerable customers from paying high out-of-contract prices. And in here, the commitment really is focused on vulnerable customers, because that's the area where we had the biggest concern. And again, the commitments differ between providers, but it means that they will not be paying these high out-of-contract prices again. And we have also undertaken a number of projects that have involved a mixture of guidance, guides, and regulations. And in June of this year, so in July of this year, we published our best practice guide on vulnerability, and that just sets out really how we expect providers to treat vulnerable customers. And it's not as strong in regulation, but it's, it provides a set of examples that we expect providers to follow, and we would have concerns if they weren't following that. And it actually supplements sort of a principles-based regulation we have in place for vulnerable consumers. And we have also published new rules on switching, requiring all providers to requiring customers, to switch through a gaming provider-led process, no matter whether they're changing from networks or upgrading technologies and so on. And they also include rules on compensation. And what we have done here is supplement the rules on compensation with guidance about how that compensation should be paid, and again, how much. Again, building on the automatic compensation scheme. And again, this is guidance, but we would really have regard to that if we were concerned that people weren't treated fairly. So when we look at enforcement, the guidance is important too. And we have also set out hard rules, for example, on how customers, when the minimum period comes to an end, including the charges they have paid, what they will pay going forward if they do nothing, and what the provider could offer them instead if they recontract, including, if different, what a new customer would get. Really, just to conclude, really, just to say that looking forward, fairness will continue to be a key priority for Ofcom. So our goal continues to be that people are treated fairly by the providers, and to trust that markets operate with integrity. And our plan of work for 2021-22, which we are publishing in consultation mode next month, will explain that we expect to continue the work in this area and to achieve fairer market outcomes for customers. So we will be working with industry to implement some of the new rules that we have introduced over the last year or so. We will embark on a program of monitoring to sort of evaluate the impact of our interventions, tweaking them where appropriate. We will also continue to take into account the impact of COVID-19. We expect it will lead to challenges for both industry, for individual businesses and for families, especially in relation to affordability. So we will continue to monitor where households are having difficulties pay communication services, in particular in relation to broadband, and consider whether any measures are needed to support consumers who are financially vulnerable, and we will work with government to consider what is appropriate. So really, our strategy is now shifting again towards creating a framework which sets out the principle that we expect providers to follow, leaving them to deliver whilst we concentrate on ensuring that the markets work well, we remove friction where appropriate, and we protect customers, especially the most vulnerable. Thank you very much. And as I say, I'm very sorry that I cannot be here with you in person. I hope that you have a very interesting session. And if you ever want to discuss some of these issues or get in touch and know a little bit more about what we're doing, I will be very happy to have a chat with any of you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Right. So I should have introduced Christina before I played the video, I'm sorry. So Christina's the Director of Consumer Policy at Ofcom. She's been there since 2017. She's been responsible for introducing what she outlined there, the automatic compensation scheme, and involved in driving Ofcom's step change and fairness program. Before coming to Ofcom, she worked at the Competition and Markets Authority and the Office for Fair Trading. So I wonder if one aspect that was quite interesting in what Christina was raising is that the automatic compensation scheme that she's describing there is a bit like our customer service guarantee, but ours is a form of direct regulation. What Ofcom the path that Ofcom has adopted is not a co-regulatory one, but a voluntary self-regulatory, and we're at the direct regulation end on that matter. But I guess what's perhaps most at stake in coming back to this issue of the form of regulation that we started discussing before is perhaps the Telecommunications Consumer Protections Code, and that's I think it's fair to say that in ACAN's view, that's kind of at the centre of the question about what might become direct regulation, and similarly for Telstra, it's something that might become more self-regulatory. So maybe I could ask Teresa and Michael for you to reflect on an aspect that Karen was raising, which is under your proposals, and we're talking now about the ways in which rules are formed, I guess, rather than say enforcement aspects. Under your proposals, which would go in different directions, Teresa, you're more comfortable with consumers not being at the table for drafting the rules and instead for the regulator to do that than the current situation. And Michael, your approach to rulemaking under a changed environment would be that there would be consultation initially, but then industry would draft the rules, and presumably there'd be consultation later. So I wonder if maybe you could both just elaborate a little on that and this kind of rulemaking formation in the light of what we've heard from Christina, but also what we've heard from Karen about, I guess, what Karen described as the kind of the added level of legitimacy that comes from that level of participation by consumers in the actual rule formation aspect. So Teresa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I think we should just clarify what we mean by our proposal. So We think that the regulator, the government, should play a market stewardship role where they're steering and shaping the consumer protection regime. So we're not saying it about all regulation in the telecommunications space, because we do think there is a place for self-regulation and co-regulation in some aspects. And there we would see consumers still being at the table as they are now. Our big problem with consumers being involved in code development is because of the lack of enforcement at the end of the day. It's not that we don't think consumers should have a voice, they absolutely should have a voice. But I just think at the moment we're overstating how much of a voice consumers actually get in industry code making, because even though you presented that we get invited sometimes to the industry consumer advisory group, it's very rare. We don't have much engagement with that group. Most of their dialogue is without us. We used to be involved in an earlier version of that, but no longer. That hasn't been for several years. There's usually only one consumer representative on code development committees. We've had to fight very hard to get more than one. In the past, we've had equal representation. That definitely works better. We also question whether in fact the independent chairs are actually independent, because there's no consumer consultation in their appointment. There's no time specific limit on how long the negotiation can go on for. So basically, it's like you're being locked in a room until you agree sometimes. And the quality of the rules you end up with can actually only lead to poor enforcement, because you've got really unclear statements like take reasonable steps or have regard to, which are really unclear. And we wouldn't necessarily have a problem with going more outcomes directed, principles based. We've had that discussion in the past. The first iteration of the TCP code, when ACAM was established back in 2012, we set out with that premise. Both sides agreed, let's do that. We ended up with prescription because of the negotiation process that went on. And we ended up with an instrument that wasn't enforceable. And when it comes to financial hardship, the customer detriment, we don't want to wait to see consumers suffering enormous detriment and wearing the cost of that, like we've seen in mobile premium services as one example, before we actually get action. And we're talking years and years and years. So some of us at ACAT have been involved for more than 10 years in relation to that kind of regulation. And unfortunately, those customers will never see their money back, even the ones that should have got compensation. Anyway, it's enough for me.
So, Teresa, can I just check then that even in your view, even if the enforcement aspect was changed so that in fact breaches could be acted on sooner, or suspected breaches, or if that end was improved in your view, there are still too many problems with the actual environment for rule formation under co-regulation.
There needs to be a complete rethink about how that process happens, because at the moment the consumers involved in the process are not adequately supported to actually get a fair and equal outcome. And so even though we do believe consumer voices should be heard, we don't think the code development process gives us any more access to the outcome or influence than actually when the ACMA goes out with a consultation about a draft and a discussion paper. For us, it's less onerous, but possibly more equul. Okay.
All right, thank you. And so, Michael, to pick up on a couple of those points and something in the questions, is it possible that if what Teresa's described as the compliance and enforcement aspect was addressed, do you see that that your model would have some kind of value, or might have better buy-in, perhaps, if the compliance and enforcement aspect was addressed, but there was an alternative approach to the rule formation? How do you see your outcomes-based approach? How do you see the rule formation in a way that avoids the lengthy periods of time, the kind of the conflict-based negotiation that's arisen in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think if Teresa's comments are really well made, and I also, Christina's comments from Ofcom as well, I think point to this, which is it's critically important that we have deep consumer group engagement in the process for setting the rules. And I think there was also a point there around how do we make sure that we get a much broader group. So I think the push to address the process of how that engagement works, and having some guidelines around how that process should work so that it gets the right engagement, I think is appropriate. But writing rules by committee, I think you always end up with a sort of a long drawn out process and somewhat unclear rules. So we have to be careful about that. I think the other piece is, I think what we're saying is we're looking for the regulators to set the outcomes.
Right.
And so I think Teresa made a point, which I think is valid, around there was a lot of negotiation around the outcomes that were required, and then we ended up going to a rules base because we sort of had that conflict based on the outcomes. So I think if we can get to that position where we clearly set the outcomes, and I won't call them minimum, but we clearly set the outcomes, and then we improve the engagement process. Although I know there's some different views on the how that Comms Alliance engagement process work, but I think there's always room to improve deeper and more constructive engagement with consumer groups, particularly ACAM, but also to the point raised, a broader group of stakeholders that can represent the needs of vulnerable customers. I think that's absolutely where we should, discuss and debate and make sure that we've got a consultation process or a development process to give legitimacy to the rules, that really gives legitimacy to the rules. But the outcome should come from the regulator, not the industry. So the definition of the outcome should come from the regulator. The rules of how you achieve that outcome, we think are better developed by the industry, with as much engagement both, and I would assume the regulator needs to engage with those consumer groups on the outcomes that are important. The industry groups should be engaging with the consumer groups in a way that works, and if there's issues with that, we should address those in them setting those rules. So I think legitimacy of those rules and engagement more broadly is important, but also legitimacy of the outcomes and engagement around those outcomes is important.
Okay, great. All right, and Karen, maybe I can come to you. There's a comment about that Ofcom's arrangements are voluntary, but they can move to direct regulation if the voluntary scheme is not producing good outcomes. So I guess maybe it is a sense of what Michael's suggesting, of the regulator setting some outcomes, but in a sense it's an interesting variation on regulatory approaches, isn't it? Because Ofcom's got a very I mean, in some ways it's an interventionist approach in that it's a very keen eye on what's happening. There is that is the image that that Christina provided us of the carrot and the stick. It's not kind of self-regulation as we might envisage it, but perhaps it is moving more towards a kind of a model that Michael's describing. But there is this sense, maybe is there more of a sense in the UK, or what we're seeing from Ofcom, of Teresa's comments on the other end, which is the kind of the possible compliance and enforcement end?
Yeah. Well, certainly. I mean, certainly, kind of the carrot and stick approach. I mean, in the regulatory literature, I mean, there's a lot of that, and unfortunately, the way that the Part 6 framework was designed was that, that the ACA and ACMA have never really been in a position to impose the big stick. The delays, that are kind of inbuilt into the process in terms of the number of chances that industry is given in order to kind of formulate rules and whatnot. Unfortunately, the process is lengthy, and of course, incorporating kind of different voices into a process is inevitably, I think, going to kind of add more complexity, although query kind of the legitimacy, if that trade-off is worth it. Perhaps I mean, really, I think kind of the point that Teresa's making is that, well, perhaps kind of ACAN's prepared to trade off efficacy for legitimacy, if that's feasible. I mean, one point I would like to make in this kind of the conversation about the co-development is that, and I think any shift to a direct regulatory model, particularly in the Australian context, I do think, and none of the submissions that I looked at kind of preparing for today's talk really talked about ways of incentivizing ACMA to kind of effectively remain on the ball in this. Now, you know, kind of over the 20 plus years that ACMA has been involved in some way with co-regulation, I mean, we've seen cycles of attention and inattention to kind of co-development processes. And I think that kind of perhaps in a shift to a co-regulatory, or kind of a shift away from a co-regulatory model, we might need to be thinking about how do we actually kind of ensure that ACMA is incentivized to use the big sticks where appropriate and not settle for kind of less confrontational type of kind of enforcement arrangements. Because it ultimately, you know, the big sticks are only going to be as kind of as useful if indeed they are, if there's a legitimate prospect of them being used. And I certainly think kind of Ofcom perhaps has had a kind of a longer and stronger history in that regard.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Karen. Teresa, you've got a minute at the most.
I just want to say, just to pick up the comment on efficacy traded for legitimacy. Many consumer advocates don't view rules decided on by the industry for the industry as legitimate. And that's all I'll say.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. We need to wrap it up there. Very grateful for your participation today. So just to recap, I'd like to thank all of you, Michael Eklund, Teresa Corbin, Karen Lee and Christina Luna Esteban. I'd also like to thank Joe Ryan, who runs the IRC Secretariat here in Australia, and our colleagues at IRC HQ in London, led by Lynn Robinson, who've done an amazing job in a year with a great many challenges. The recording will be available on the IRC website. We're hoping that you can join us next year for some further events, and in the meantime, ponder some of the issues that have come up today. They think there's no one agreed approach that's kind of developing, but I think one thing that we can say from today's discussion is that the department was on the money when it outlined that there's actually a great deal of dissatisfaction with the way in which the current scheme is drafted. So wherever it goes remains open to discussion, but it's certainly a topic that was worth discussing. So once again, thanks very much to all of our panelists. Thanks to everyone for joining us for the webinar, and we'll see you next year.